What are business rules? As we can see here, business rules are individual elements that can be defined. They can be limited and expressed in an understandable way. They're entities that contain information that are declarative and don't execute anything. So, in order to perform something, in order to use a business rule, we need a process. So what the process is going to do is going to go search for the business rule it needs, and once it has the business rule it needs, it can use it to execute whatever has been defined to be or whatever needs to be done in a process. So business rules are independent from the processes. The business users usually access the business rules repository and they can modify them, they can change them, they can create new business rules. And these business rules are going to affect one or more processes. We're going to see how to build all of this structure. If someone wants more information about business rules, we can read this manifesto edited by the Business Rules Group. As it says here, there's part of a process or parts of processes that are constantly changing, like interest rates, wages, policies, work timetables, discounts, and so on. However, a class of process is not meant to be changed oftenly. So usually when I have a change in a policy, in an interest weight, maybe discounts, I don't want to be modifying my classes of process all the time because this is not how we're supposed to work. We're supposed to have the business people, uh, they're supposed to be able to access their business rules repository, make a change in the discount, and that makes all of our processes change their way of their interaction automatically without having to change the process. So the business rules are not defined in the process, they're outside, they're a different entity, and they must be defined and maintained independently. And on the other side, we have the process rules. These are a different type of rule. We're not really going to talk about them much throughout this presentation, but process rules are rules that have been defined inside of the class of process. For example, a gateway. You say, well, when the language is English, go through the right outlet. When it's Spanish, go through the left outlet. That would be a process rule. This is something that's defined within the logic of a process, and obviously when you change it, you have to change the configuration of the class of process. So that's the main difference between business rules and process rules. We could also talk about other types of rules, for example, interface rules. Maybe we have conditional logic in a form. When someone inputs a value in a certain field, it affects what the form is going to display in the next phase or in the next step of the form. But today we're just going to focus on business rules. So given that business rules are independent, any user can modify these rules, obviously if they have permissions. And by doing so, hundreds of classes of process are going to be affected, or dozens, or as many as are using this business rule. So it's not going to be necessary for a consultant to readjust all these processes one by one. Each time we need to apply a new business rule. So which business rules should we use? If we're talking, well, what rules should we use? If we're talking about things that are changing frequently and they affect several processes, for example, an interest rate that affects a process for personal loans, for mortgages, risk management, etc., then we'd probably want to use a business rule, something that's independent of the class of process, and every time the rule changes, all the processes that are being affected by this rule are going to change the way in which they work. Then there's process rules. When are we going to use the process rules? Well, when we're talking about something that's not going to change frequently, something that only affects one unique process. For instance, when a manager approves a request, the process continues, or if not, the process ends. In this case, it's very clear that we're going to use a process rule. And form rules, as we also know them as conditional logic, they define what a user can be doing based on the data that's provided. So we're only going to use form rules when there's a user interacting within a form. So in the form editor, we're going to create these rules. Here we can see the different types of rules. There's textual rules, assignment rules, calculation rules, inference rules. They're all used for different things. For example, a textual rule is just text. That's it. So it's a descriptive text with clarifications, instructions. They're always going to require human interpretation. These textual rules, they're not meant to be used by automated systems. So when we use them in a process, a textual rule can appear as the instruction, for example, of a task. Let's imagine we have a textual rule and it's called email signature. And in this textual rule, we have a signature for all the emails that are going to be automatically triggered in a process. Well, we could use this rule in lots of different processes. And if at some point we want to change the footer of our email, we just have to go to the business rule, change that bit of text, and from that moment on, all of our processes are going to have a different footer. So we just have to change something once in one unique place, and it affects, I don't know, maybe dozens or hundreds of parts of a process. Then there's the assignment rule. In this case, all we have to do is assign a parameter or a value to each one of these parameters. So for example, we can put a rating. We type in a number 5, and once we've done this, every time our processes are triggered and they're using this rating, they're going to apply that number 5. If we change the rating at some other point in time, the new processes are going to start applying the new rating that we added here. Then there's calculation rules. These calculation rules are defined by using formulas, different algebraic operations, statistics, comparatives, etc. And they're always going to be operating with numerical values. We already know how to create calculations because we did this in a system task earlier in the previous presentation. But anyways, it's basically the same. When we're creating business rules, we can also create calculations, and within these calculations, we can combine fixed values with dynamic values, or even with other business rules. And then there's the inference rules that allow us to create a matrix with column and rows, and these metrics are called criterions, except for the last column, that's the result column. And basically we're going to say, well, for example, if the color is blue um, and it's in the morning, we'll then go running, for example. If the color is red and it's nighttime, then go jogging, for example. So these business rules, inference business rules, are also quite easy to set up. We're going to see that all we have to do is add some criterions and give them some results. And then we can use these results based on the data that's been input in a process. So maybe if in the panel of the process we have the value red and we have the value um, morning, for example, well then it's going to give me back a certain value based on whatever criterions and qualifications I've added here. There's different types of relations between the business rules. For example, a textual business rule doesn't allow us to combine it with any other type of rule. They're not related to any other rule. So when I use a textual rule, I can only use a textual rule. I can't use it in combination with other rules. Then there's assignment rules. These don't allow the inclusion of other rules, and their values can be updated manually or via an uploader system task. When we say here that the values can be updated manually or via an uploader system task, this is because when we use an assignment rule in a process, we could change the value in the panel of the process, but we could also update the value in the business rule. The same thing we do, for example, with suffixes. When we're working with a suffix in a process, we can say, well, I want to upload this value in this suffix, and I only want it to affect the panel of my process. Or I also want it to be changed in the source record. Well, here it would be exactly the same. I want to change the value of an assignment rule, but where? Only in the panel of the process, or do I also want to change this value in the source business rule? So if I mark a certain option that we're going to see later, the business rule would be changed in the panel, and besides, it would also be changed in the source. Then we have calculation rules that allow us the inclusion of other calculation rules, of assignment rules, and of inference rules. So basically, within a calculation, I could combine all three different types of business rules. And then there's the inference rule that allows the inclusion of other calculation and inference rules.